My parents didn't realize I had moved to another state, but now my father is demanding I visit them or he'll stop funding my college. I responded by telling him I graduated a year ago and now earn 10 times his salary. From the moment I could remember, my younger brother, Ryan, was the center of our family's universe. He was the prodigy, the one who could do no wrong, while I was always the reliable, good enough older sibling. Whenever Ryan did something as simple as scoring a goal in a weekend soccer game, my parents would gush about it for days. In contrast, when I won a regional science competition, they barely managed a congratulatory nod before shifting back to discussing Ryan's latest achievement. Over the years, I got used to this imbalance. It was just the way things were. When college applications rolled around, I felt a small surge of hope. I'd been accepted into a prestigious out-of-state university, and it seemed like my chance to finally carve out a space for myself. But my parents had other plans. They insisted I attend the nearby state school so that I could stay close to home and not outshine Ryan. They framed it as family unity, but I knew the truth. It was just another way to prioritize Ryan's comfort over my future. I tried to reason with them. I earned a scholarship to one of the best schools in the country, I argued, but they wouldn't budge. This will give you stability, my mom said, as if stability was more important than opportunity. My father was more blunt. Ryan needs his older brother nearby, he added, making it clear where their loyalty lay. In the end, I agreed. At least that's what they thought. The truth was, I had already accepted the offer from my dream school. The scholarship covered my tuition, and the money my father sent for state school expenses was now padding my savings. I found a small, affordable apartment 2 states away, and within weeks, I was living a double life. The first semester was surreal. I was finally thriving, free from my parents' constant comparison to Ryan. I met people who valued me for who I was, not for how I measured up against my brother. I excelled in my studies, joined clubs, and built a network of friends who became my support system. It was everything I dreamed of and more. The hardest part was keeping up the charade with my parents. They never questioned my absence during school breaks, probably because they were too busy with Ryan's sports events and college prep. My visits home became less frequent until they stopped altogether. I made excuses about group projects and internships, and my parents never pushed back. Their lack of curiosity was both liberating and heartbreaking. Graduation came faster than expected, and with it, a job offer from a top company that paid a salary I could have never imagined. My life was finally my own, free from the shadows of home. Yet there was a part of me that couldn't fully celebrate. The realization that my parents hadn't noticed my absence for nearly 4 years left a bitter taste. A year had passed since I graduated from my dream college. I was living independently, with a thriving career and a life that felt fully mine for the first time. My parents, meanwhile, were still wrapped up in Ryan's wedding plans, seemingly unaware of my existence. I hadn't heard from them in months, and honestly, I was fine with that. But then one evening, my phone rang. It was my father. I stared at the screen for a moment, unsure whether to answer. When I did, his voice was as authoritative as ever, cutting straight to the point. "You need to come back for Ryan's wedding," he demanded. "It's in 3 weeks, and we expect you to be there." His tone irritated me. There was no warmth, no curiosity about my life, just another command. But what caught me off guard was his next line. "If you don't show up, I'll stop paying for your education." I couldn't help it. I laughed. It wasn't just a chuckle. It was a full, bitter laugh at the irony of the situation. Here was my father, still trying to hold financial power over me when I hadn't relied on his support in years. "Dad," I said, my voice calm but firm, "you don't need to threaten me about college anymore. I graduated a year ago. I'm earning 10 times what you do. I don't need your money." The line went dead silent. I could almost hear the shock through the phone. For years, my father had controlled me with the idea that I needed his financial support. Now, in one swift moment, I had taken away his last piece of leverage. "You graduated?" he finally asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and confusion. "Why didn't you tell us? Where have you been living? Why didn't I tell you?" I repeated, feeling a mix of anger and sadness welling up. "Because you never asked. You didn't notice when I stopped coming home for holidays. You didn't notice when I moved 2 states away. You didn't even notice I was gone." His voice shifted, softer now, almost pleading. "But you're still family. Why did you leave? We would have supported you, you know that." The frustration I'd held back for years finally broke free. "No, Dad, you wouldn't have. You only cared about Ryan, and I was just the other child you had to tolerate. I was tired of being second place, tired of pretending that your support was genuine. So I left and did something for myself for once. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of everything left unsaid over the years. I expected him to apologize or show some sign of regret, but what he said next caught me off guard. "You're still coming to the wedding, right?" It was such a casual question, so devoid of acknowledgement for what I'd just revealed, that it stung more than any insult. Here he was trying to repair a fractured relationship by making it all about Ryan again. "Dad, I'll think about it," I said, my voice flat. "But don't expect me to be guilt into coming. Not anymore." I hung up before he could respond, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and relief. It was the first time I'd stood up to my father without fear of losing his approval or his money. I wasn't sure if this was the start of something better or the final break, but for the first time, I felt truly free. But part of me wondered, would they ever see me as more than an afterthought, or was I better off moving forward without looking back? The fallout from my confrontation with my father hit harder than I anticipated. My phone buzzed relentlessly with calls and texts, all from my parents. The messages alternated wildly. Sometimes my mother's pleading voice asking me to just come back for Ryan's sake, and sometimes my father's cold, curt accusations of betrayal. They painted me as the selfish child who had turned their back on the family. But I knew the real reason behind their desperation. It wasn't about love or family ties. It was about maintaining the illusion of a perfect family. My sudden success and departure from their narrative had disrupted that image, and they were scrambling to regain control. Amidst this storm of messages, one stood out. It was from Ryan. He'd always been the golden child, getting the attention and praise I'd never received. The text was brief. "We need to talk." And soon enough, the call came. "How could you be so cruel?" Ryan asked, his voice laced with both frustration and hurt. "Mom's been crying nonstop, and Dad's barely talking to anyone. Do you really think you're better than us now?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "Ryan, this isn't about me being better. This is about me finally being honest. I lived in your shadow my whole life, and no one seemed to care when I was struggling. Now that I've made something of myself, it's suddenly a problem." He paused, and for a moment I thought he might actually listen. But then his tone shifted to one of entitlement. "You think you have it all figured out? You have no idea what it's like to deal with Mom and Dad's expectations. You were always the one who got away with doing your own thing." I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. "You really believe that, don't you? You think I was lucky to be overlooked?" I wasn't given a choice. I had to make my own way because I didn't have anyone in my corner. Ryan's anger flared up again. "This wedding is important, not just for me, but for the family. We're supposed to be there for each other, no matter what." "I have been there," I said, my voice low but firm. "But not once did anyone ask about me, my life, or my dreams. This wedding isn't about family. It's about pretending everything is fine." Ryan let out a frustrated sigh. "So, you're really not coming?" "No, I'm not," I said simply. "And not because I hate you, Ryan. It's because I finally learned to put myself first." There was silence on the other end, and I could sense that this was a turning point. Whether it meant the end of our relationship or a chance for change, I couldn't tell. "Fine," Ryan said finally, his voice resigned. "But just know that you're hurting more than just Mom and Dad. You're hurting me too." I hung up feeling conflicted. I knew I had chosen the right path for myself, but the lingering guilt of abandoning my family, no matter how toxic, was hard to shake off. It felt like a battle between my newfound strength and the remnants of the loyalty that had kept me in chains for so long. In the days that followed, I heard whispers through mutual friends. Apparently, the wedding planning was becoming a disaster. There were financial issues, and Ryan's fiancée was showing a side of herself that no one had anticipated, demanding, manipulative, and obsessed with status. It seemed like the perfect facade was beginning to crack. And as I watched from a distance, I couldn't help but wonder, was this my family's karma, or simply the reality I had managed to escape? Either way, I was finally free from the web they'd spun for years. But the guilt lingered, and I knew I still had more battles to face. It was as if karma had finally caught up to my family, but not in the way I'd expected. The rumors about Ryan's fiancée spread like wildfire. A mutual friend called me one evening with the juiciest piece of gossip yet. Ryan's soon-to-be bride wasn't just a gold digger. She was a full-fledged con artist. She had pulled similar stunts with other wealthy families, getting them to bankroll lavish weddings before disappearing with the money. I couldn't help but feel a mix of shock, pity, and, if I'm being honest, some twisted satisfaction. For once, the golden child wasn't getting his way. My parents, who had always believed that Ryan could do no wrong, were now forced to face the harsh reality of their misplaced favoritism. Then came the bombshell. The wedding was canceled. Ryan was devastated, and my parents were scrambling to recover both financially and emotionally. My father's desperation reached new heights when he called me, his voice a mixture of anger, exhaustion, and fear. "We're in serious trouble," he confessed. "She's taken everything. The wedding expenses, the down payment on Ryan's new house, and even some of our savings. We're practically broke." I took a moment to absorb his words. This was a man who had always been proud, who'd never asked for anything from me except compliance. And now, here he was, asking for help in a way I'd never heard before. It was both surreal and heartbreaking. "You have to come back," he continued, his voice cracking. "Ryan is a mess, and your mother, she can't stop crying. We need you." The part of me that had always yearned for their approval wanted to jump at the chance. Here it was, my opportunity to swoop in, be the hero, and maybe even gain the acknowledgement I'd been denied for so long. But the other part of me, the one that had worked so hard to break free from their grip, saw it for what it was, another attempt to use me. I took a deep breath. "I'm sorry you're going through this, Dad, but I'm not coming back." The silence on the other end was palpable. For the first time in my life, I had truly denied my parents something they wanted. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. "How can you be so heartless?" my father asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and anger. "We're family. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" Family. That word had always been used to manipulate me, to make me feel guilty for wanting something different. But this time, I was ready to respond. "I try to be a part of this family, Dad," I said firmly. "But you only called when you needed something. You didn't even notice when I left. I can't keep sacrificing my well-being just because it's convenient for you." He tried one last plea. "Ryan needs you. We need you." But I was resolute. "I hope you find a way through this. But it won't be with my help." I hung up, feeling a mix of liberation and sadness. It was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, but it was also one of the most necessary. I wasn't just walking away from the mess they'd created. I was walking away from a lifetime of being overlooked, used, and undervalued. Ryan's situation continued to unravel. Mutual friends told me he was spiraling, his trust shattered, his finances in ruins. My parents, now financially vulnerable for the first time in decades, were selling off assets to recover what they could. The perfect family was falling apart, and for once, I wasn't caught in the middle. But this newfound independence came with its own set of challenges. For years, my identity had been tied to my family's approval, even if I rarely received it. Now, I had to figure out who I was without that constant need to prove myself to them. When I refused to come back and bail them out, I could practically feel the shift in my father's demeanor through the phone. The disappointment, the anger. It was all there, simmering just beneath the surface. "You're really going to turn your back on us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with an edge that made my skin crawl. It was as if the years of built-up resentment, manipulation, and control had condensed into this one moment. It stung, but I knew I couldn't let his words shake me. I had spent too many years sacrificing my own dreams for the sake of family unity, only to be treated like an afterthought. I wasn't about to go back to that. "I'm not turning my back," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I'm just choosing myself for once, and you'll have to accept that." There was a long, tense silence on the other end, and then the line went dead. He had hung up on me without another word. Part of me had expected more, an attempt at guilt-tripping, another round of manipulative tactics, but this was different. It was like he realized I wasn't budging this time. For a few minutes, I just stood there staring at the phone in my hand. I felt a strange combination of emotions, relief, sadness, and even a bit of guilt, but the weight that had been crushing my chest for so long was suddenly gone. I had finally made my stand, and while it hurt, it also felt right. In the following days, I kept my distance. My parents didn't reach out again, and I knew they were too proud to admit defeat. Ryan was still in damage control mode, and from what I heard through the grapevine, my parents were struggling to sell off assets and downsize. Their once grand lifestyle was crumbling, and for the first time, I didn't feel compelled to save them from the mess they had created. That sense of freedom allowed me to focus on the life I had built for myself. I threw myself into work, started making new friends, and even began dating, things I never had the time or emotional space for while trying to win my family's approval. It felt like I was rediscovering who I was piece by piece. Then, one day, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from my father. The envelope was plain, the handwriting familiar, but unsteady. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, unsure of what I'd find. Inside was a single sheet of paper, filled with words that were both surprising and strangely vulnerable. I know I was hard on you, and I know I wasn't fair. I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping the family together, but I see now how much it cost you. I won't ask you to come back, but I wanted you to know that I am sorry. I've realized how much I took you for granted. Maybe one day we can start over, but I understand if you're not ready. Just know that I do love you. The letter was unexpected, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me wanted to crumple it up and throw it away, while another part of me saw it as the olive branch I had waited for my entire life. It was a small step, just words on a page, but it was also the first time my father had acknowledged the pain he'd caused. I decided not to respond right away. I wasn't ready to forgive, but I wasn't ready to completely sever ties either. Maybe in time we could rebuild something, but for now, I needed to keep moving forward on my terms. For once, my story wasn't about trying to earn someone else's approval. It was about living for me, with the understanding that real love isn't about control or manipulation. It's about freedom, respect, and ultimately, finding peace with yourself, even when others don't understand. As the months rolled by, I started hearing more about what was happening with my parents. The scam had left them financially devastated. They were forced to sell their large house and move into a smaller, more modest home. The lavish lifestyle they had once flaunted was gone, and the golden pedestal they'd placed Ryan on had started to crack. Ryan, who had always been the center of their attention, was now a daily reminder of their misplaced priorities. After his fiancée vanished with their money, he had no choice but to move back home. The family dynamics had shifted, and the proud favorite was now just another source of disappointment. The whispers among our extended family painted a bleak picture. My parents, still trying to maintain appearances, were barely managing, while Ryan struggled to find direction. It was surreal to witness this downfall from a distance. There was a time when I would have felt guilty for not being there to help. But as I heard the stories through mutual contacts, I realized that I no longer carried that burden. I wasn't responsible for their choices or their consequences. While they were grappling with the fallout, my life was moving in the opposite direction. I had recently moved into a bright, modern apartment, my own space that felt truly mine. It was a far cry from the cramped, makeshift living arrangements I had started with when I first left home. My days were filled with meaningful work, and my nights were spent with friends who had become like family. It was liberating to be surrounded by people who saw me for who I was, not who I was supposed to be. One evening, as I sipped wine on my balcony and watched the city lights twinkle, I thought back to that final phone call with my father. I remembered the sense of guilt that had once plagued me, the constant feeling of not being enough. But now, it felt like I was looking at someone else's life, one that I had outgrown. Then, one day, I received an unexpected call from my mother. It was the first time I had heard her voice in months. She was hesitant, her tone unsure. "I know you're busy, but can we talk?" I was caught off guard. The old me would have dropped everything, rushing to bridge the gap. But this time, I took a breath before responding. "I'm open to talking," I said cautiously. "But it can't be the same as before. Things need to be different." Her voice broke, and I could hear her tears over the line. "I know we hurt you," she said, her words slow and measured. "We were wrong. I see that now. I just want to understand if there's any way to start over." It wasn't the apology I had longed for, but it was a step. I told her that rebuilding trust would take time, and that I needed space to decide what kind of relationship, if any, I was willing to have with them. As the call ended, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was hopeful, but another part remained guarded. I had finally learned that my worth wasn't tied to my parents' approval, and I wasn't going to lose that hard-won clarity. Over the next few weeks, I focused on my own life. I traveled, went on dates, and even took up painting, a hobby I had once loved but abandoned in the chaos of my past. Each brushstroke felt like another layer of healing, a way of filling in the empty spaces that had been left behind. I didn't hear from my parents again for a while, and I didn't mind. I was no longer driven by the need to be noticed, acknowledged, or validated by them. Instead, I was finally living in the present, free from the shadows of the past. For the first time in my life, I realized that true family isn't always the one you're born into. It's the one you build for yourself, with people who see you, respect you, and support your growth. It was a lesson learned the hard way, but it was worth it. As the sun set over the city that had become my new home, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. No matter what happened next, I knew I had found something more valuable than approval or acceptance. I had found myself. Months after that unexpected call, my mother tried once again to reach out. This time, Her voice sounded genuinely softer, almost pleading. It wasn't the usual tone of superiority that I had grown up with. It was hesitant, almost vulnerable. "We've been thinking about everything," she said, pausing to steady her voice. "And we realize we made mistakes. We're sorry, truly. We never meant to hurt you like this." Hearing those words, the apology I had waited for my entire life, was surreal. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, hoping it would heal the wounds of the past. But now, it felt more like a band-aid on a wound that had long since scarred over. I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or bitter. Maybe both. "I appreciate the apology," I replied, my voice even. "But it's going to take more than words to fix this." Her voice broke a little. "I understand, but we really want to make things right. We don't want to lose you." I could sense the urgency, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was born more out of desperation than genuine remorse. The fallout from Ryan's wedding debacle had left them isolated, financially strained, and with no one else to turn to. Suddenly, I was no longer the invisible child. I was the lifeline they had never noticed before. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," I said honestly. "This isn't something that can be repaired overnight. You can't just expect me to forget everything that happened." My mother sighed, and for a moment, I thought I heard her stifling tears. "I understand if you need time," she said, "but we'd like to try, if you'd let us." There was a long silence between us, filled with years of resentment, missed opportunities, and words left unspoken. I wanted to believe her, to think that my parents were capable of real change. But deep down, I knew that trust wasn't built in a day, and I wasn't ready to put myself back in a position where I could be used or overlooked again. "We'll see," I said finally, a non-committal answer that was as honest as I could manage. "I need to protect myself first." My mother's voice turned hopeful. "We understand, really. Just please don't shut us out completely." I didn't make any promises, but I agreed to meet them for a casual dinner when I was ready. It was a tentative step, not towards forgiveness, but towards clarity. I needed to see for myself whether they were truly capable of change, or if this was just another attempt to pull me back into their orbit. When the day of the dinner finally arrived, I felt a mix of anxiety and resolve. We met at a quiet restaurant, the kind of place that was neutral territory for difficult conversations. My parents looked different, older, wearier, and not just from age. The years of treating me as an afterthought had caught up with them, and they seemed to realize that for the first time. The conversation started awkwardly, filled with small talk about work, the weather, and how Ryan was trying to get back on his feet. It felt forced, like we were strangers pretending to be a family. Eventually, my father leaned forward, his voice surprisingly sincere. "We really messed up," he admitted. "We put too much on you, and we didn't give you the recognition you deserved." My mother nodded. "We should have been better parents. We know that now." It was a moment of raw honesty, but I remained cautious. "I'm glad you see that," I said. "But you have to understand, I'm different now. I've built a life without needing your approval, and I can't go back to being the person I was." They both nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. "We don't expect you to come back," my father said. "We just want to be part of your life again, in any way you're comfortable with." It was the most genuine conversation we'd ever had, and it left me feeling conflicted. Part of me wanted to accept their olive branch, to believe that people could change. But the other part of me knew that reconciliation had to be on my terms, not theirs. As I left the restaurant that evening, I felt a sense of closure. Maybe they truly were trying to change, but I wasn't going to rush into a reconciliation just because they needed me now. I had learned the hard way that my happiness didn't depend on their validation, and I wasn't willing to sacrifice my newfound peace for a second chance that might never fully materialize. For the first time, I felt like I was truly in control of my own life, and it was a feeling I wasn't willing to let go of easily. The past had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. A few weeks after my parents' failed attempt at reconciliation, Ryan, who had always been the golden child, finally reached out. But this time, it wasn't the same Ryan I had known growing up. The confident, arrogant brother who had always gotten his way had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything," he began, his voice shaky. "But I really messed up, and I don't know where else to turn." Hearing the desperation in Ryan's voice was surreal. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. He was no longer the untouchable favorite. He was just a man who had fallen hard, trying to find his way back up. Despite everything he'd done, I could see the vulnerability he was hiding behind his words. The years of our parents' favoritism had set him up to fail as much as they had forced me to succeed on my own. "I need your help," he continued. I've lost everything, the money, the fiancé, and now mom and dad barely talk to me. It was a strange feeling seeing my brother so broken. This was the same Ryan who had mocked me for choosing to leave, who had thrived under the praise and attention our parents lavished on him. Yet here he was standing in front of me, admitting defeat in a way I'd never thought possible. I'm not asking for money, he added quickly. I just need some advice. I've got nothing left, and I don't know how to start over. Part of me wanted to help him, to show him that it was possible to rebuild even after hitting rock bottom. After all, I had done it myself. But another part of me knew that extending a hand to him would mean stepping back into a world I had fought so hard to leave behind. I don't know what to say, Ryan, I replied, my voice measured. I want to feel bad for you, but this is what happens when you never learn to stand on your own. I've spent years trying to escape this toxic cycle, and I can't just jump back into it because you're struggling now. His eyes, which had always been so full of confidence, now brimmed with regret. I get it, he whispered. I know I've treated you like crap. I know I don't deserve your help. But I don't know how to move forward. For a moment, I considered offering some advice, even if it was just a small gesture to show that I didn't hold on to the past with the same bitterness as before. But I realized that any help I gave him now would be more about easing my guilt than actually helping Ryan grow. I hope you find your way, I said, my tone softening a bit. But I can't be the one to fix this for you. You need to figure this out on your own, just like I had to. Ryan's shoulders slumped, and I could see the disappointment in his eyes. But I also saw something else, maybe a flicker of understanding. He wasn't used to people saying no to him, and this was a lesson he needed to learn, painful as it was. Okay, he finally said. I get it, but I just want you to know. I'm sorry. For everything. It was an apology I hadn't expected, and for a moment, I felt a sense of closure. Not the kind that comes from forgiveness, but the kind that comes from knowing you've finally been heard. I watched as Ryan walked away, unsure of what the future held for him, but confident that, for the first time in my life, I was no longer bound by the expectations or needs of my family. Ryan's desperation was real, but so was my newfound resolve. I wasn't responsible for fixing the messes that others had created, and I wasn't going to compromise my peace just to play the role of savior. It was a hard boundary to set, but it was necessary. And as painful as it was to turn my back on my brother, I knew that it was the only way for both of us to truly move forward, separately, but hopefully for the better. As the months passed, I felt lighter than I had in years. The constant weight of seeking my parents' approval was gone. I no longer worried about their judgment or about fitting into the mold they had created for me. For the first time, I was free to build a life that was truly my own. My career took off in unexpected ways. I landed a promotion at work that came with a bigger office, a larger team, and more responsibilities. But unlike before, these accomplishments weren't fueled by a desire to prove anything to anyone but myself. I was driven purely by passion and a desire to excel, and it made all the difference. Work became not just a means of survival, but a place of fulfillment. Beyond work, I started reconnecting with things that had once brought me joy. I dusted off my old guitar and spent weekends learning new songs. I signed up for cooking classes, discovering a love for making homemade pasta and experimenting with new recipes. I even joined a local hiking group, and the peace I found in nature became a soothing escape from the chaos of the past. The life I was living now felt intentional. Every decision was my own. I also built new friendships that weren't tied to my family's drama. I found people who genuinely cared about me, not because of any shared past, but because of who I had become. These new connections weren't always easy. Trust was still something I had to work on, but they were authentic. I had never felt so truly understood. I even dipped my toes into dating again. After years of focusing solely on my career and survival, I finally felt ready to let someone in. I met a woman named Claire at a coffee shop one morning, and we hit it off instantly. She was smart, funny, and had a sense of curiosity about life that matched my own. For once, I wasn't hiding anything about myself. I shared my past, my family struggles, and my journey to independence, and she accepted it all. One evening, as Claire and I walked along a quiet street lined with autumn trees, she turned to me and asked, "Do you ever regret leaving them behind? Your family, I thought about it for a moment. There's a part of me that wishes things could have been different, I admitted. But I don't regret choosing myself. It was the only way I could break free." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "It sounds like you made the right choice. Sometimes you have to let go of people, even family, to truly find yourself." Her words resonated deeply. I had spent so much of my life trying to fit into a world that had no space for me, but now I had found my own space. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments when the old guilt crept back in, but those moments were fleeting. I was no longer defined by my parents' neglect or by Ryan's entitlement. I was defined by my own choices, and that realization was incredibly liberating. One afternoon, as I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, looking out at the city skyline, I thought about how far I had come. I was no longer the invisible child, overshadowed and overlooked. I had learned to stand up for myself, to set boundaries, and to let go of the need for validation from those who had never really seen me. Life wasn't easy. It never would be, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. I had reclaimed my story, and I was writing a new chapter, one filled with hope, freedom, and the promise of a brighter future. Sitting in my sunlit apartment one morning, sipping coffee, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. It was strange to think about how far I'd come, both geographically and emotionally. The past few years had been a whirlwind of growth and unexpected turns, each step leading me further from the shadows of my family's expectations and closer to my own identity. My phone buzzed with a new message from my mom. I hadn't blocked my parents. Despite everything, I never quite felt the need to completely shut them out. The message was another attempt at reconciliation. We really want to talk to try and understand what we did wrong. I stared at the screen for a moment, feeling the familiar tug of guilt mixed with pity. I had spent so many years craving these words, an apology, a willingness to understand. And yet, now that they had finally come, they felt hollow. I knew that the regret was real, but I also knew that it came too late. I put the phone down and focused on my own life. In my heart, I held no hatred for my parents or even for Ryan. There was a deep sadness, yes, but it was balanced by the sense of freedom I'd earned. My success, my independence, and my peace of mind were hard-won, and I wasn't going to sacrifice them for a past that had no place in my present. I learned that the ultimate revenge isn't about proving people wrong or showing them what they lost. The real victory is finding peace with yourself, regardless of whether others recognize your worth. It wasn't just about earning more money than my father or seeing Ryan's golden boy image crumble. It was about understanding that I was enough all along, even when they failed to see it. The loneliness I once felt had been replaced by a quiet but powerful self-assurance. I wasn't the same person who had cowered to keep the peace or sought approval where none was given. I was stronger now, no longer defined by my family's blindness. As I walked through the city streets later that day, passing by bustling cafes and vibrant parks, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for the pain I'd endured, but for the courage I found within it. I had chosen to take the difficult path, to move forward despite the obstacles, and in doing so, I had discovered my true self. My story wasn't just one of escape, it was one of transformation. I realized that family can be both your greatest support and your biggest challenge, but ultimately, your identity is yours to shape. Letting go of what I couldn't change and embracing what I could had made all the difference. And so, as I stood on the threshold of this new chapter, I knew one thing for certain. I was finally free. Not just from my parents or Ryan's shadow, but from the need for external validation. I had found my worth within, and I was living my own life on my own terms. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real, and that was enough.